In the year 705 AD, Lady Wang stood trembling in the imperial palace as guards approached her with armfuls of white silk. She didn't scream yet, that would come later. What she felt in that moment was something far worse than fear of death. It was the realization that everything she had ever worn, every symbol of her status and refinement, was about to become the instrument of her destruction. And the truly horrifying part, this wasn't an execution. This was a performance, a calculated psychological warfare designed exclusively for women like her, aristocratic women whose very existence represented power and elegance in Tang Dynasty China. You see, we think we understand ancient torture. We imagine dungeons and devices of iron and wood, instruments designed to break bones and extract confessions. But what happened in the inner courts of imperial China was something altogether more sinister. It was torture that didn't just destroy the body. It dismantled identity itself, piece by piece, thread by thread. And it did so using the one material that defined these women's entire social existence. Silk, the same fabric that had adorned their bodies since childhood, that represented their family's wealth and their personal virtue, that separated them from common women and marked them as untouchable members of the elite. That silk became their death shroud, their prison, and their destroyer all at once. The process began with humiliation. Guards would strip the victim completely bare. And for a woman who had never been seen undressed by anyone beyond her husband, this alone was a form of death. Her entire life had been built around modesty, dignity, and the careful preservation of honor. Now she stood naked before servants and executioners, her social identity already beginning to unravel. What they were only beginning. The executioners would then bring forward bolt after bolt of the finest silk, soaked in water until it was heavy and pliable. They would begin wrapping the victim from her feet upward, layer upon careful layer, as though preparing her for burial. Except she wasn't dead yet. She was entirely, painfully conscious. Here's what made this torture truly diabolical. Silk has a peculiar property. When wet, it's soft and flexible, but as it dries, it contracts, it tightens. And when you've wrapped a human body in dozens of layers of wet silk, that contraction becomes a slow, methodical strangulation. The victim could feel it happening. First, the pressure around her toes, gentle at first, almost imperceptible. Then tightening, her feet going numb. The sensation creeping up her legs as the silk dried and shrank, squeezing flesh and cutting off circulation. Hours would pass. The silk continued its work, indifferent to screaming or pleading. Fingers turned blue. Arms lost feeling. The pressure around the chest made each breath a battle. And through it all, the victim remained conscious, tracking her own death fiber by fiber. But the physical agony was only half the torture. The other half existed entirely in the mind, because every aristocratic woman in China knew what silk meant. It meant beauty, safety, status, power. It was woven into every memory of her life, every moment of pride and accomplishment. And now those same threads were crushing her to death. The psychological destruction was absolute. The executioners weren't just killing her body. They were corrupting every positive association she'd ever had with the symbol that defined her existence. One monastery record preserved her victim's words, spoken hours into her ordeal when she could still speak. "Please," she begged, "give me the sword. Let me die like a warrior. Don't let the silk take me." But mercy was never the point. If you're still watching this, you understand that history's darkest chapters deserve to be remembered, not buried. Subscribe now because the story gets even more disturbing. And what I'm about to reveal will change how you think about power, gender, and psychological warfare in ancient civilizations. The worst part isn't what happened to these women. It's why it happened, and who weaponized this nightmare for political control. The architect of silk torture's most brutal applications was Empress Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, a woman so brilliant and ruthless that her name is still whispered with a mixture of awe and terror 13 centuries after her death. Wu didn't invent the silk cocoon, but she understood something her male predecessors never had. She understood that for aristocratic women, the destruction of dignity was more terrifying than the destruction of flesh, and she wielded that understanding like a blade, eliminating rivals and consolidating power in ways that left no blood on her hands, only silk threads and broken minds. Wu faced a unique problem when she seized the throne in 698. As a woman ruling in a Confucian society that viewed female power as fundamentally unnatural, she couldn't simply execute her enemies the way male emperors did. Traditional beheadings or hangings would make her look threatened, weak, as though she feared competition from other women. But silk torture offered something far more elegant and terrifying. She could frame it as punishment for moral corruption, as though the victim's own virtue was being literally squeezed out of them by the symbol of refinement itself. The charge was always the same: adultery, conspiracy, behavior unbecoming of an aristocratic woman. The evidence was always conveniently discovered, and the sentence was always the silk cocoon. The true genius of Wu's strategy wasn't in the executions themselves. It was in the fear they created. Court records revealed that she didn't need to use silk torture frequently. The threat alone kept potential rivals paralyzed. Every aristocratic woman in the empire knew that their beautiful robes could become their executioner at the empress's whim. They slept on silk. They wore it every day. and now it carried an undercurrent of terror. Wu had turned the very fabric of noble women's lives into a psychological weapon that required no armies, no obvious violence, just the ever-present knowledge that elegance and death were woven from the same threads. The most documented case of Wu's silk torture reveals the full scope of her calculated cruelty. In 695 AD, Lady Zhang, wife of Crown Prince Li Shan and Wu's own stepdaughter-in-law, began gaining favor among court officials. She wasn't plotting rebellion. She wasn't conspiring against the empress. Her crime was simpler and more threatening. She was becoming popular, respected, a potential alternative center of female power in the court. Wu moved with surgical precision. Lady Zhang was arrested on fabricated charges of adultery. The evidence was testimony from servants who had been tortured until they gave the required statements, and the sentence was the silk cocoon. Historical records preserve Lady Zhang's final words before the rapping began. "Your Majesty, I have served the imperial family with complete faithfulness. Why must I die wrapped in shame?" Wu's response, witnessed by dozens of court ladies who were required to attend, was chilling in its symbolism. "The silk shows your true nature," the empress said. "Beautiful on the surface, but deadly when bound too tightly to power." Lady Zhang's execution took 14 hours. Court ladies were forced to watch the first 4 hours, standing in silent witness as the silk dried and tightened, as Lady Zhang's pleas turned to screams and her screams eventually faded to gasping breaths. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you threaten the empress's control. This is what your beauty and status become when power turns against you. After Lady Zhang's death, Wu never needed to use silk torture again. The fear was enough. The lesson had been taught, and it worked. For the remaining decade of Wu's reign, no aristocratic woman dared challenge her authority. The silk cocoon had become more effective than any army. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. When the Tang dynasty finally fell in 907 AD, silk torture vanished from Chinese history almost overnight. New dynasties didn't just stop using it. They actively banned it, not because medieval China had suddenly developed humanitarian concerns. This was an era with no shortage of brutal execution methods. They banned it because witnesses to silk torture suffered lasting psychological trauma. The method was too effective at creating horror, too devastating in its psychological impact. Buddhist monasteries, which had begun documenting and opposing the practice, argued that suffering should serve either justice or enlightenment, but silk torture served neither. It existed purely to maximize psychological destruction, to break minds rather than extract truth. By 960 AD, the method had disappeared so completely that later historians questioned whether it had ever truly existed, whether it was myth or propaganda rather than documented fact. Only the discovery of monastery records in the 1970s, accounts preserved by monks who had witnessed these executions and been so horrified they documented them as warnings to future generations, confirmed that this nightmare was horrifyingly, undeniably real. The silk cocoon wasn't just an execution. It was the ultimate expression of how patriarchal power could weaponize even symbols of beauty against women who dared to threaten established order. It revealed a truth that echoes across centuries. The same things that give us identity and status can be turned into instruments of control and destruction. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the psychological principles behind silk torture never really disappeared. The tactic of turning someone's source of strength into their weakness, using their own identity as a weapon against them, these strategies didn't vanish with ancient China. They simply evolved, appearing in different forms across different societies, always finding new ways to destroy not just bodies but the very sense of self. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling on ancient horrors. It's about recognizing the patterns of psychological warfare that persist in our world, hidden beneath more civilized surfaces. So I want to ask you something.